Power is not in the sword, but in the mind. Those words, written by a forgotten medieval scholar, were scribbled in the margins of a crumbling manuscript, a desperate plea from a world where ideas could topple kings. Picture this, an empire at its zenith, stretching from the deserts of the east to the shores of the west, united not just by conquest, but by a shared vision of order. Yet beneath the surface, a silent war raged, one fought not with steel, but with ink and argument. This is the story of how two philosophies, each claiming to hold the secret to truth and justice, tore that empire apart from within. It's a tale of scholars who became generals, of debates that decided destinies, and of a rift so deep it echoes even in our world today. What makes this clash so extraordinary? Imagine two men standing in the same grand hall, both advisors to the emperor, both believing they held the key to the empire's survival. One argued for tradition, for the wisdom of ancestors carved into stone. The other preached revolution, a bold new vision that would shatter old gods and old laws. Their battle wasn't waged on a battlefield, but in the whispers of courtiers, the pages of forbidden books, and the hearts of ordinary people forced to choose sides. And when the dust settled, the empire was no longer one, it was two, divided not by rivers or mountains, but by the unbridgeable gap between two ways of seeing the world. Why does this matter now? Because the same forces that split an empire 1,000 years ago still shape our lives today. The struggle between old and new, between unity and change, is written into the DNA of every society. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. And as we unravel the secrets of this forgotten duel, you'll start to see its fingerprints everywhere, in the way nations rise and fall, in the way we argue about truth, even in the way we decide who gets to speak and who must stay silent. So let's step into the shadows of the past, where the fate of millions hung on the weight of a single idea, and discover how a war of words became a war that reshaped the world. At the height of its power, this empire was a marvel, a golden thread stitching together deserts, mountains, and seas under a single banner. Caravans heavy with spices and silk moved along roads patrolled by soldiers in polished armor, while scholars in sunlit courtyards debated the nature of justice beneath mosaics of lapis and gold. The emperor's word was law from the bustling ports where a dozen languages mingled, to the farthest garrison towns where the empire's banners snapped in the wind. But what held it all together wasn't just fear or force, it was an idea. The belief that order, hierarchy, and divine favor had destined this civilization to unite the known world under a shared vision of truth. The architects of this vision were as remarkable as the empire itself. Take Grand Vizier Nizar, the brilliant administrator who designed the tax system that funded libraries and aqueducts, insisting that prosperity must lift all citizens, not just the elite. Or Lady Amina, the general's daughter turned philosopher, whose treatises on civic duty were recited by schoolchildren across the provinces. These figures didn't just build an empire, they gave it a soul. Their words became the bedrock of its identity, repeated in court decrees and etched into temple walls. Yet success carried the seeds of its own unraveling. As the empire grew richer, its people began asking dangerous questions. Was unity meant to preserve tradition or to inspire change? Should the emperor's authority come from ancient rituals or from his ability to adapt? In the marble halls of power, two factions crystallized around these questions. The harmonists, robed in the deep blue of the old nobility, preached that the empire's strength lay in obeying the eternal laws of heaven. Across from them stood the Reformists, their green sashes a nod to the fertile valleys that fed the realm, arguing that stagnation would be their downfall. At first, the debates were civil disagreements between friends sharing wine after council meetings. But as droughts parched the southern farmlands and bandits grew bold along the trade routes, the arguments turned urgent. The harmonists pointed to crumbling scrolls, warning that abandoning tradition would anger the gods. The reformists brandished maps of the restless frontier, insisting innovation was the only path to survival. The emperor, caught between them, hesitated, and in that hesitation the first cracks appeared, tiny fractures in the foundation of a realm that once seemed unshakable. What no one foresaw was how quickly those cracks would spread. A tax revolt in the western mines sparked by a reformist pamphlet. A harmonist priest burned alive by a mob for refusing to bless a new canal. The ideals that had built the empire were now pulling it apart as ordinary people began choosing sides in a war that hadn't yet been declared. The scholar's pen and the farmer's plow were becoming weapons, and the stage was set for a conflict that would redefine what it meant to be part of this civilization, or to rebel against it. The harmonists didn't just believe in tradition, they saw it as the very oxygen that kept the empire alive. Their leader, the silver-tongued philosopher Thaddeus of the White Tower, put it bluntly, "A tree that forgets its roots will topple in the first storm." To him and his followers, every law, every ritual, every stroke of the emperor's pen had to echo the wisdom of ancestors who had built civilization from wilderness. They pointed to the empire's golden age, centuries of peace under the Great Code, a legal system so precise it dictated everything from the width of irrigation canals to the proper way to bow before a magistrate. The code wasn't just rules, it was a sacred covenant, a promise that order would triumph over chaos so long as men honored the past. Walk through any harmonist stronghold, and you'd see their philosophy etched into stone. Temples rose in perfect symmetry, their pillars carved with the faces of long-dead sages. Market inspectors carried notched rods to ensure cloth merchants sold bolts of exact dimensions, just as their great-grandfathers had. Even the empire's famed mosaic artists worked within strict traditions. No blue tile could touch a red one unless the pattern had been approved by the Guild of Symbols. This wasn't stagnation, the harmonists argued, but refinement. Like a master vintner aging wine, they believed society improved only through patient adherence to proven ways. Yet for all its elegance, this system had cracks. When floods wiped out entire villages, harmonist governors delayed rebuilding until astrologers confirmed the stars favored construction. A farmer could be flogged for planting a new crop without the local priest's blessing, even as famine loomed. The philosophy's greatest weakness lay in its refusal to admit that the world outside was changing. Beyond the empire's borders, new technologies like water mills and siege engines were reshaping kingdoms. Within them, merchants chafed at guild restrictions, while soldiers muttered that blind obedience to old tactics had cost them battles. The harmonists' most vocal critic within the court was Lady Sarene, a historian who dared to point out the irony. You worship ancestors who were revolutionaries. The builders of the Great Code tore down the tribal laws that came before them, yet you treat their work as if it were handed down by the gods. Her words struck a nerve. Young scholars began smuggling in scrolls from rival nations, comparing their flexible legal systems to the empire's increasingly rigid one. Even some harmonist loyalists started quietly questioning whether tradition had become a cage rather than a foundation. By the time the emperor called his infamous grand debate, the tension was palpable. Thaddeus arrived with a procession of monks chanting verses from the Great Code, while his opponents wore foreign cut robes as a silent protest. What began as a philosophical discussion soon laid bare the Empire's existential crisis. Could a civilization survive by looking backward while the world raced ahead? The answer would come not from words, but from the streets where a new generation was already choosing sides between the safety of the past and the terrifying promise of the unknown. The reformists saw the Empire not as a monument to preserve, but as a living thing that needed to grow or wither. Their firebrand leader, the scholar-turned-Drebel Elias of Marikand, put it plainly: a river that refuses to bend will shatter the stones beneath it. While the harmonists whispered in candlelit archives, Elias preached in crowded market squares, his voice cutting through the din of merchants and artisans. His manifesto, The Unfinished City, became the movement's Bible, arguing that the Empire's greatness lay not in rigid traditions, but in its people's ability to reinvent themselves. Our ancestors were not caretakers of the past, he wrote, but thieves who stole fire from the gods. We dishonor them by clinging to their ashes. What made the reformist vision so electrifying and so dangerous was its radical inclusivity. Where harmonists saw order in hierarchy, Elias spoke of talent over birthright. A lowborn inventor's water pump could save more lives than a noble's 1,000-year-old prayer, he argued. Merchants loved his attacks on guild monopolies, while young soldiers cheered his calls for promotions based on merit rather than family crests. Even some disillusioned nobles, like the fiery Lady Varia, joined the cause after seeing how outdated farming laws left their tenants starving. Tradition, she famously declared, is just peer pressure from dead people. The movement's stronghold was the port city of Tel Ashan, where shipbuilders mixed foreign designs to create faster vessels, and scribes smuggled in texts from across the known world. Here, the reformists didn't just talk, they built. Engineers redesigned aqueducts to use half the stone. Doctors trial-tested herbal remedies from distant lands, and playwrights staged dramas where commoners outwitted kings. The city became a living experiment, proving that innovation wasn't chaos, it was survival. A visiting harmonist magistrate recoiled at the unholy noise of its workshops, where apprentices debated philosophy over the clang of hammers. Yet for all its energy, the movement had a fatal flaw: speed. Reformists wanted to tear down walls that had stood for generations, but offered no clear blueprint for what would rise in their place. When Elias proposed letting villagers elect their own judges, traditionalists gasped who would stop them from voting in drunkards or fools. His answer, "Trust the people," sounded noble but rang hollow to those who'd seen mobs burn granaries during bread riots. Even sympathetic scholars worried that dismantling old structures too quickly might leave the empire with nothing to lean on when storms came. The clash between these worldviews wasn't just philosophical, it was personal. Harmonist scholar Thaddeus once shared a meal with Elias, their debate lasting until dawn. Witnesses swore they parted not as enemies, but as heartbroken friends who knew their ideals would eventually force them to choose between loyalty and progress. That moment came when drought struck the eastern provinces. The harmonists urged fasting and penance to appease the gods. The reformists distributed seed drills from a neighboring kingdom. When the drills produced a harvest while prayers failed, the divide ceased being academic. Villagers began painting green reformist symbols on their doors, a silent rebellion that turned towns into battlegrounds of belief. By the time the emperor summoned both factions to the capital, the air smelled of smoke rather than incense. Reformist students had burned copies of the Great Code in protest, while harmonist zealots smashed experimental looms that threatened the Weavers' Guild. What began as a war of words had become a struggle for the empire's soul, and neither side would leave that marble hall without blood on their hands. The real question wasn't who would win the debate, but whether anything would remain standing when the shouting stopped. Behind every great clash of ideas stand the people who lived and breathed them not as abstract concepts, but as urgent truths worth fighting for. On one side stood Thaddeus of the White Tower, the harmonist silver-tongued champion. Born into a family of imperial archivists, he could recite every clause of the Great Code by age 14. His opponents whispered that he loved ancient scrolls more than living people, a charge that stung because it held a grain of truth. For Thaddeus, tradition wasn't just policy, it was personal. His own father had been stripped of his titles during a brief reformist purge, leaving the family destitute. That trauma shaped his unwavering belief. Without the code's strict boundaries, society would collapse into the same chaos that had nearly destroyed his childhood. His rival, Elias of Marikand, carried scars of a different kind. The son of a stonemason and a midwife, he'd watched his sister die from a fever because the local priest refused to allow a foreign doctor's treatment. That moment ignited his lifelong war against what he called the tyranny of the past. Unlike the aristocratic Thaddeus, Elias moved through the world like a wildfire, charismatic, unpredictable, and utterly convinced that the empire's survival demanded radical change. Where Thaddeus quoted legal precedents, Elias told stories of the weaver whose new dye technique fed a village, of the soldier promoted for bravery despite his low birth. His genius lay in making reform feel inevitable, even sacred. Their clashes became the stuff of legend. During the famed vineyard debate, Thaddeus arrived with a caravan of scribes carrying chests of historical records to prove his points. Elias countered by bringing farmers whose lives had been ruined by outdated laws. Witnesses said the two men argued for 9 hours without pause, their voices hoarse as the sun dipped below the horizon. At one electrifying moment, Elias snatched an ancient scroll from Thaddeus' hands and declared, "Your ancestors wrote this with quills, must we still write our future with the same broken tools?" The crowd gasped. Thaddeus looked as if he'd been struck, yet their rivalry was more complex than it seemed. Private letters reveal reluctant mutual respect. "Elias sees farther than any man I know," Thaddeus once confessed to a colleague, but he runs toward cliffs without checking for bridges. Elias, in turn, wrote of Thaddeus, "He guards the past like a dragon hoarding gold, not out of greed, but fear that without it, we'll have no light to guide us." This tension between preservation and progress played out in smaller figures too. Lady Varia, the noblewoman who secretly funded reformist schools while publicly condemning them, or the harmonist judge who privately updated legal texts but dared not admit it. As their ideas polarized the empire, the philosophers' duel ceased to be academic. Reformist sympathizers in the military began bypassing the chain of command, while harmonist governors withheld taxes from the capital. The emperor, paralyzed by indecision, vacillated between both camps until his authority eroded like a sandcastle at high tide. When famine struck the northern provinces, Thaddeus' faction distributed grain according to centuries-old rationing rules, leaving entire regions starving because their population quotas hadn't been updated. Elias' followers seized storehouses and redistributed supplies based on need, igniting riots against the old system. The breaking point came not from speeches or scrolls, but from something painfully mundane, a disputed inheritance case. A merchant's daughter, barred by tradition from inheriting her father's business despite being his most capable heir, appealed directly to the emperor. Thaddeus argued that bending the rules would unravel the social fabric. Elias demanded the law reflect reality. When the emperor delayed his verdict, armed mobs from both sides clashed in the streets. The philosophers' war of words had finally spilled blood, and neither ink nor parchment could stop what came next. The emperor stood at the center of the storm, a figurehead straining to hold together a realm tearing itself apart over questions with no easy answers. His throne room, once a stage for grand ceremonies, had become an arena for dueling ideologies. Each morning brought fresh petitions, harmonist elders kneeling with scrolls of precedent, reformist envoys brandishing maps of unrest in the provinces. His advisors were no longer unified counselors but spokesmen for their factions. The treasurer, a staunch traditionalist, argued that changing tax laws would invite divine wrath. The Master of Roads, a covert reformist, countered that maintaining crumbling highways in the name of tradition was bankrupting the realm. Every decision had become a choice between past and future, with no path forward that wouldn't enrage half his subjects. At first, the emperor sought balance. He extended the harvest festival by one day to please traditionalists, while quietly approving reformist designed plows for drought-stricken farmlands. These small concessions only emboldened both sides. The harmonists saw compromise as weakness and doubled down, demanding the execution of scribes who transcribed foreign texts. The reformists, sensing opportunity, flooded the streets with pamphlets calling for a complete overhaul of the imperial bureaucracy. Even the emperor's family fractured. His eldest son openly wore reformist green to court, while his sister hosted secret salons where harmonist poets lamented the empire's decline. The crisis reached its zenith during the infamous Moonlit Council. With famine spreading and border provinces threatening secession, the emperor summoned both factions to his private gardens. Thaddeus arrived with a delegation of white-robed monks carrying the original Great Code on a litter, as if it were a sacred relic. Elias brought farmers, blacksmiths, and a blind woman who'd lost 3 children to a plague that foreign medicine might have cured. The emperor, usually a master of ceremony, faltered. He offered a middle road, preserved the code's core principles while allowing regional governors to adapt minor laws. It was a disaster. Thaddeus accused him of sacrilege, tearing his robe in the traditional gesture of mourning. Elias scoffed, calling the proposal half a loaf for the starving. That night, harmonist hardliners met in the Temple of Dawn, swearing oaths to purify the empire by any means necessary. Reformist militias began drilling outside city walls, repurposing farming tools into weapons. The emperor's compromise hadn't bridged the divide. It had proven to both sides that persuasion was futile. Historians would later pinpoint this moment as the turn from debate to bloodshed. When the emperor's spies reported that Thaddeus' allies were stockpiling weapons in monastery vaults, he ordered their arrest only for the city guard, their loyalties divided, to leak the plan. Elias' followers stormed the armories first. By dawn, the marble courtyards where philosophers once debated were littered with broken seals and trampled scrolls. The war of ideas had finally, irrevocably, become a war of swords, and the emperor, who had spent years trying to placate both sides, now faced an unbearable truth: his empire could no longer stand divided. It would have to choose or fracture forever. The breaking point came not with a declaration of war, but with the burning of the scroll of Anath, a sacred text both sides claimed to revere, but for very different reasons. On the eve of the emperor's birthday, as thousands gathered in the capital's great square for the annual reading of the scroll, a band of radical reformists stormed the speaker's platform. Their leader, a former monk named Joram, held the ancient parchment aloft and shouted, "You chain your children to dead men's words." Then, before the horrified crowd, he cast it into a brazier. The flames consumed centuries of tradition in seconds, leaving only ashes swirling in the torchlight. Reaction was instantaneous. Harmonist scholars collapsed to their knees, tearing their robes and wailing as if witnessing a murder. Reformists in the crowd, many of whom had never endorsed such extremes, found themselves branded as blasphemers by association. By dawn, mobs had razed Joram's neighborhood, while his sympathizers retaliated by looting the Temple of Dawn's library, tossing priceless manuscripts into the river. The emperor, paralyzed by shock, ordered the city gates sealed, but the damage had already escaped the walls. News spread like wildfire. In the northern provinces, Harmonist governors ordered reformist meeting halls demolished. Coastal cities, long hotbeds of innovation, expelled traditionalist priests into the wilderness. The empire's famed messenger roads, once arteries of unity, now carried whispers of rebellion and counter-rebellion. A merchant traveling from the capital to the eastern frontier reported passing through 3 towns where the imperial crest had been defaced, once with Harmonist blue paint, twice with reformist green. The final fracture came when General Verk, commander of the Western Legions, made his choice. A lifelong traditionalist, he marched his troops into a reformist stronghold and ordered the execution of every scholar who couldn't recite the Great Code's opening tenets. His justification: to save the empire from those who would unmake it. Reformist militias, until then loosely organized, coalesced overnight under a single banner, a broken quill crossed with a sword. What began as a war of ideas had become a war of survival, and the empire, as it had existed for centuries, was already gone. In the chaos, a single detail haunted both sides. The scroll of Anath, it was said, had contained a prophecy about the empire's fate. It will not fall to invaders, but to its children, who loved it too fiercely in different ways. Now, with ashes still drifting over the capital, those words felt less like prophecy and more like epitaph. Words became weapons long before the first sword was drawn. In taverns and town squares, the battle for the empire's soul was fought with ink, imagery, and carefully crafted lies. The Harmonists, masters of symbolism, flooded the streets with broadsheets depicting reformists as vandals tearing pages from sacred texts, never mind that those same texts had been used for generations to justify oppression. One particularly vicious woodcut showed Elias of Marikand as a jackal gnawing on the bones of the empire's founders, his claws wrapped around a scroll labeled Chaos. Beneath it, a rhyming couplet warned, "He who abandons the old ways / will wander hungry all his days." The reformists fought back with equal ferocity. Their pamphlets, printed on cheap rag paper and passed hand to hand, recast Harmonists as grotesque figures clinging to mummified corpses. A famous cartoon showed Thaddeus of the White Tower trying to weigh grain with a 1,000-year-old scale while children starved at his feet. Worse still were the personal attacks whispers that Harmonist leaders hoarded gold while peasants ate sawdust, or that reformist meetings were orgies of drunken blasphemy. Truth became collateral damage. What mattered was which lie stuck. Artists and playwrights were conscripted as unwitting soldiers in this war. Harmonist-sponsored temple murals began depicting the empire's history as an unbroken chain of divine favor, with any deviation shown as a catastrophic rupture. Reformist street theater, meanwhile, performed raucous satires where bumbling traditionalists tried to cure plague victims by reading them legal statutes. Even children's rhymes were weaponized. A popular jump rope chant in reformist neighborhoods went, "Blue robes sigh / green robes try / who'll still stand when the old ways die." The real tragedy lay in how these tactics turned neighbors into enemies. A potter who'd shared tools with his rival for decades might wake to find his workshop marked with a green handprint, the reformist symbol for collaborators. A weaver caught humming a traditional hymn could have her loom smashed by self-appointed patriots. The empire's famed postal system, once a marvel of unity, now carried denunciations instead of letters. A single report from a village scribe captures the madness. Brother accused brother over supper, the charge owning a blue sash from his wedding day. By the time armed conflict erupted, the groundwork had been laid in mines long before battlefields. Maps tell the story best, not of troop movements, but of graffiti. The Western Highlands, where Harmonist monks had taught for generations, became a sea of blue sigils daubed on doors and wells. The fertile river valleys, choked by outdated irrigation laws, turned overwhelmingly green. What began as philosophical disagreements hardened into territorial divides, with towns expelling minorities and burning foreign books. The empire wasn't just splitting ideologically, it was cracking along geographic fault lines, each side convinced they were saving civilization from the other's madness. And so, when the first soldiers marched, they marched into villages where children already knew which side to hate, not from experience, but from stories whispered like poison in their ears. The real war hadn't started on the day blades clashed, but on the day a farmer hesitated to sell grain to an old friend whose door bore the wrong color mark. That silent moment of distrust was the true point of no return. The ideological rift that had simmered in lecture halls and courtrooms now carved itself into the earth. Like a river changing course, the empire split along invisible but undeniable lines, regions where green banners fluttered from watchtowers, and others where blue pennants marked every crossroads. The fertile river valleys, long choked by outdated irrigation laws, became reformist strongholds overnight. Here, millwrights and merchants tore down the old guild signs and replaced them with the broken quill symbol of Elias movement. Meanwhile, the mountainous highlands, where monasteries had preserved ancient texts for centuries, doubled down on tradition. Villagers painted their doors with the white tower of Thaddeus, and any reformist preacher daring to enter risked being pelted with stones. This wasn't just a matter of philosophy, it reshaped the land itself. In reformist territories, engineers dynamited harmonists built dams to redirect water to starving fields, while traditionalist provinces let crops rot rather than use unblessed tools from foreign lands. The empire's famed messenger roads, once lifelines of unity, became fraught with danger. A courier carrying a harmonist decree might find his throat slit at a reformist checkpoint, just as a merchant selling new seed varieties could be stoned in a traditionalist village. Even the seasons seemed to divide loyalties. Spring planting festivals in reformist areas now featured debates on crop rotation, while autumn harvests in harmonist lands included rituals unchanged for 900 years. Military outposts became ideological battlegrounds. The Western legions stationed along the restless frontier had always valued pragmatism over tradition. When their general, a grizzled veteran named Orlan, declared for the reformists, his troops followed without hesitation, repainting their shields with green sigils and melting down ceremonial armor to forge practical breastplates. But in the southern garrisons, where officers came from noble families, soldiers swore oaths on the Great Code before meals. These divisions turned brother against brother. The famed Silver Shields, an elite cavalry unit, fractured when twin brothers chose opposing sides. Their final duel, fought at sunrise on a bridge neither would let the other cross, became legend. Trade collapsed first. Harmonist merchants refused to do business with heretic ports, strangling the flow of spices and silk. Reformist cities retaliated by taxing traditionalist caravans into oblivion. The economic chaos birthed strange bedfellows. Bandit kings grew rich smuggling grain between hostile regions, while pirate fleets, once the empire's scourge, found themselves hired as privateers to protect rival supply lines. In the capital, the emperor's mints worked day and night to produce new coins stamped with opposing slogans, until money itself became a political statement. Along the burgeoning borderlands, tension simmered into violence. The town of Veils, straddling a river that marked the informal divide, saw its bridge burned 3 times in as many months. Farmers who tilled the same land for generations awoke to find their fields bisected by makeshift fences. A particularly vicious skirmish erupted over a centuries-old olive grove when harmonist monks claimed the tree's sacred roots justified ownership, while reformist farmers argued their labor made the harvest theirs. By the time the last tree was hacked down for firewood, 12 lives had been lost over fruit neither side would taste. Desperate attempts to reunite the empire only deepened the divide. When the emperor proposed a grand council at the neutral city of Astara, reformist delegates arrived to find the gates barred by harmonist militia. A later truce, brokered by a respected astronomer who predicted an eclipse as heaven's plea for unity, collapsed when both sides accused the other of manipulating the celestial charts. The final straw came when the imperial crown prince, sent on a goodwill tour, was nearly assassinated by radicals from his own faction, the would-be killer's chilling justification. Better no empire than one poisoned by compromise. What began as a war of words had hardened into something far more permanent. Surveyors sent to map the new frontiers returned with troubling reports. Villagers on both sides were digging moats, not just around towns, but around entire regions. The empire's great roads, once polished smooth by generations of travelers, now sprouted weeds in their cracks, and in the silence between clashes, a new sound emerged. The rhythmic hammering of stonemasons carving boundary markers, each chisel strike echoing the same unspoken truth: some wounds don't heal. They just scar over, leaving the land forever changed. The emperor's last, desperate bid for unity came in the form of the Council of Astara, a gathering meant to be neutral ground, where delegates from both factions could meet beneath olive trees rather than siege engines. He offered what he thought was the perfect compromise: preserve the Great Code's core principles, but allow regional governors to adapt minor laws based on local needs. To sweeten the deal, he even proposed a joint library where harmonist and reformist scholars could collaborate. The mediators, a group of elderly sages from neutral provinces, presented the terms with ceremonial fanfare, unrolling a parchment that promised unity through flexibility. It took less than an hour for the plan to unravel. Thaddeus' delegation refused to sit at the same table as defilers of the sacred texts, while Elias' followers scoffed at the idea of preserving what they called the rotten pillars of a dying system. The breaking point came when a harmonist priest demanded all reformist delegates undergo purification rites before speaking a deliberate insult disguised as tradition. The resulting shouting match turned physical, with inkwells hurled like missiles and the sacred olive branches meant to symbolize peace snapped underfoot. By nightfall, the council grounds resembled a ransacked battlefield, the emperor's carefully drafted accords used as kindling for rival bonfires. Military campaigns fared no better. General Orlan, leading the imperial legions, attempted to retake the rebellious city of Tel Ashan by cutting off its water supply only for reformist engineers to reroute the aqueducts overnight, turning the siege into a humiliating stalemate. Meanwhile, harmonist militias seized mountain passes, claiming they were keeping the empire's soul pure by blocking trade with reformist regions. The emperor's own generals were divided. Some followed orders reluctantly, while others openly defected to their preferred faction. A poignant diary entry from a young cavalry officer captures the absurdity. Yesterday we charged a fortress flying the imperial banner. Today we learned it was held by our own side, just a different interpretation of imperial. Key figures emerged as would-be peacemakers, only to be crushed by the weight of their own ideals. Lady Varia, the noblewoman who'd secretly funded reformist schools, attempted to broker a truce by hosting a feast with dishes from both traditions. The gesture backfired when harmonist guests accused her of poisoning the sacred salt bread, while reformists mocked the elaborate table rituals as theater for corpses. Even the revered astronomer Nazir, who predicted the eclipse meant to symbolize reconciliation, was branded a traitor by both sides: harmonists for meddling with divine signs, reformists for appeasing superstition. The final nail in the Empire's coffin was the Battle of Twin Rivers, where opposing armies found themselves camped on opposite banks of the same winding waterway. For 3 days, soldiers who'd trained together under the same banners shouted across the currents, each side pleading for the other to see reason. Then at dawn on the 4th day, someone no one ever confirmed who loosed the first arrow. What followed wasn't a battle but a massacre, with brothers drowning in the same mud that had once grown the Empire's wheat. Survivors reported a haunting detail. The river ran red, but where the currents met, the blood didn't mix. It swirled in separate ribbons of crimson and scarlet, a macabre mirror of the divide no diplomacy could heal. In the end, the Empire didn't fall to a single decisive blow. It crumbled like a bridge with too many cracks, each failed compromise widening the gaps until the center could no longer hold. The Emperor, grey and hollow-eyed, issued one final decree from his half-empty palace. Regional governors could administer justice as local conditions required. It was a bureaucratic euphemism for surrender. Within months, the borderlands hardened into proper frontiers, complete with customs houses where travelers declared their allegiance not to a nation, but to an idea. The Empire had become two worlds, each convinced it was the rightful heir, and each willing to burn the past to ashes if it meant the future would bear their colors. The moment the Empire split was marked not by a single dramatic event, but by a series of quiet, devastating ceremonies that echoed across the fractured land. In the western capital, harmonist priests gathered at dawn in the Hall of Ancestors, where the Emperor, now ruler of a diminished realm, placed his seal on a document known as the Edict of Purity. With deliberate strokes of a brush dipped in blue ink, he formally renounced all ties to lands corrupted by innovation, declaring his half of the empire the true successor to its legacy. The ceremony ended with the breaking of a clay tablet inscribed with the names of reformist cities, its fragments buried beneath the palace steps as if to erase their existence. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles east, reformist leaders stood before a cheering crowd in Tel Ashan's torchlit square, burning copies of the Great Code and raising a new banner, a green phoenix rising from ashes, embroidered with the words, "From ruin, rebirth." These symbolic acts revealed how deeply each side had come to define itself against the other. The harmonist realm, now calling itself the Celestial Dominion, enshrined tradition into law with terrifying precision. Schools taught that reformists weren't merely wrong but cursed their ideas a spiritual plague. Official portraits showed the emperor holding a scale perfectly balanced between sword and scroll, while artists depicted the eastern lands as a grotesque carnival of half-built towers and leering madmen. The reformist territories, rebranded as the Free Provinces, went further in their rejection of the past. They minted coins with Elias' profile instead of the emperor's, abolished hereditary titles, and even changed the calendar, declaring the split, year zero of the people's dawn. Trade routes that had thrived for centuries withered overnight. The famed Amber Road, once trod by merchants carrying spices from harmonist temples to reformist ports, became a no-man's land patrolled by archers. At river crossings where barges once unloaded goods from both realms, markets now featured two separate docks, blue canopied for traditionalist wares, green for approved innovations. A particularly telling incident occurred at the Bridge of Seven Arches, where harmonist merchants dumped a shipment of reformist-designed plows into the water rather than let them defile their fields. The plows, made of a lighter alloy that required fewer oxen to pull, sank like stones as both sides watched in silence, alliances shifted like sand in a storm. The Celestial Dominion found unexpected friends among conservative mountain tribes who'd long resented the Empire's reforms, while the free provinces welcomed renegade scholars and mercenaries from across the sea. Cultural exchange didn't cease, it weaponized itself. Harmonist playwrights produced tragedies where prideful inventors were struck blind by the gods, while reformist poets penned verses mocking tradition as the chains rusting on a dead man's wrists. Even children's games changed. Western kids played Codekeeper, a board game where players advanced by obeying rules, while Eastern schoolyards echoed with Rebuild, a chaotic contest where teams constructed towers from whatever scraps they could find. Yet for all their efforts to erase each other's influence, shadows of the old empire lingered. The free province's new legal system, though proudly secular, still bore the structural imprint of the great code it rejected. Meanwhile, Celestial Dominion architects designing pure temples unconsciously replicated proportions found in demolished reformist libraries. Like twins raised apart, the two realms grew differently but never fully escaped their shared lineage. Within a generation, the Borderlands developed their own hybrid culture, blacksmiths forging harmonist-style blades with reformist tempering techniques, or farmers planting traditional crops in new rotations. The division had been meant to cleanse, but history, like water, always finds cracks to seep through. By the time the first gray-haired veterans of the Schism began recounting tales to wide-eyed grandchildren, the myths had already hardened. In the West, people spoke of the split as a tragic necessity, like cutting off a diseased limb to save the body. In the East, it became a triumphant revolution, the moment ordinary people shook off the weight of centuries. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, not in the grand ceremonies that marked the breakup, but in the quiet choices of those who learned to live in the world it left behind. A world where the most dangerous borders weren't drawn on maps, but in minds. The Celestial Dominion, as the traditionalist half of the shattered empire now called itself, became a living museum of its former glory, a place where every stone, scroll, and ritual was preserved like a fly trapped in amber. Under its first sovereign, Emperor Aldrich the Steadfast, the realm rebuilt its identity around a single sacred principle. The past was not merely guidance but law. His coronation ceremony lasted 7 days, each hour meticulously reconstructed from 900-year-old scrolls. Even the embroidery on his robes replicated thread counts recorded in monastic ledgers. This wasn't just pageantry, it was a declaration that time itself would bow to tradition. Political power in the Dominion crystallized around the Council of Ancestors, a body of scholars who interpreted the Great Code with near religious fervor. Their rulings governed everything from the width of city streets, exactly 12 paces, as decreed in the original code, to the proper angle for farmers to hold scythes during harvest. Dissent wasn't just illegal, it was sacrilege. When a young governor in the southern provinces dared to suggest updating grain storage techniques during a famine, he wasn't merely removed from office. His entire lineage was struck from the imperial registry, erasing his family's history as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. Yet within this rigidity, flashes of brilliance emerged. The Dominion's artisans, bound by strict guild rules, achieved mastery through repetition rather than innovation. A single blue-tiled mosque in the capital took 3 generations to complete, each mosaic tessera placed according to ancient geometric formulas. The result, a dome so perfectly proportioned that whispers at its base could be heard clearly across the vast interior, a marvel modern architects still can't fully replicate. Poetry flourished too, though within tight constraints. The famed Odes of the Unchanging Moon cycle, composed during this era, used only vocabulary attested in classical texts. Yet within those limits, poets spun breathtaking meditations on love and loss that felt timeless precisely because they refused to be timely. The Dominion's greatest test came not from external enemies, but from the slow creep of irrelevance. While the reformist provinces embraced trade with distant lands, traditionalist merchants adhered to centuries-old routes and tariffs. When new camel breeds from the south could carry twice the cargo, Dominion caravans stuck with the slower, frailer animals prescribed in the code. Better to arrive honorably late, wrote one trade minister, than to sacrifice principle for speed. This principled slowness had consequences. By the reign of the third post-split emperor, the Dominion's currency had lost half its value compared to the province's thriving trade notes. Leadership during this decline fell to figures both tragic and fascinating. Empress Leora, known as the Keeper of Keys, spent her 20-year reign personally inspecting every archive in the realm, convinced that some forgotten clause in the code held the secret to restoring greatness. She died surrounded by unrolled scrolls, her last decree ordering the construction of a vault to preserve all knowledge unfit for this fallen age. Then there was Chancellor Voron, who attempted to solve the Empire's financial woes by enforcing a literal interpretation of the code's mining laws, resulting in teams of laborers digging shafts with bronze tools as iron picks rusted in storerooms. Ironically, the Dominion's greatest weakness, its refusal to adapt, became its most enduring legacy. While the reformist provinces evolved rapidly, their early records were often discarded as obsolete. The Dominion's obsessive preservation created an unmatched trove of knowledge. Today, historians pore over their tax records, love letters, and even grocery lists to reconstruct daily life in a way the more progressive society never documented. There's a poignant lesson here. Sometimes the act of holding on too tightly leaves fingerprints that last longer than whatever was grasped. Meanwhile, just beyond the border mountains, the reformist provinces were writing a very different story, one of explosive change, chaotic creativity, and consequences no one could have predicted. The reformist provinces didn't just reject tradition, they set it on fire and built something new from the ashes. Where the celestial dominion clung to ancient texts, the free provinces declared every blank page an opportunity. Their founding charter, etched onto a bronze slab in Tel Ashan's central square, began with a radical premise: no law shall stand longer than a generation unless the people renew it. This wasn't just governance, it was a cultural earthquake. Within months, town halls across the realm buzzed with debates over everything from crop rotation schedules to the very nature of justice. A blacksmith's daughter could challenge a noble's privilege in open court, while engineers demonstrated water pumps to skeptical farmers using live models carved from river clay. Science flourished in this cauldron of experimentation. The province's first Academy of Motion, housed in a converted silk warehouse, became a hive of wild hypotheses and messy breakthroughs. Astronomers tracked comets with lenses ground from desert glass, while alchemists, no longer bound by harmonist prohibitions, discovered alloys that made plowshares last twice as long. Their greatest triumph came when a team of surgeons, midwives, and silk weavers collaborated on a stitching technique that reduced battlefield deaths by half. Yet failure walked hand in hand with progress. An entire season's wheat harvest was lost when overeager agronomists terraced hillsides without understanding erosion, while a poorly tested bridge design collapsed during spring floods, taking 3 villages' grain stores with it. Art became the province's most potent export. Freed from guild restrictions, playwrights staged dramas where commoners outwitted kings, and muralists painted heroes with the calloused hands of laborers. The famous Song of the Unbound, composed by a former street sweeper, spread through taverns like wildfire, its lyrics celebrating the right to be wrong gloriously. But creativity had its dark side. Without traditional patronage, many artists starved, and the province's rejection of censorship sometimes descended into chaos. A traveling exhibit of truth-telling portraits depicting local leaders as animals sparked riots in 3 cities, proving that not everyone welcomed unfiltered honesty. The tension between idealism and reality grew sharpest in matters of power. Elias of Marikand had dreamed of councils where every citizen had equal voice, but within a decade, a new elite emerged, not of birth but of influence. Charismatic debate champions amassed followers like warlords, while merchant collectives wielded outsized control through trade networks. When a fire destroyed half of Tel Ashan's lower wards, the much-vaunted People's Assemblies bogged down in procedural squabbles while the wealthy rebuilt behind private guards. The contradiction was undeniable. A society built on rejecting hierarchy had created new, unspoken rules about who deserved to be heard. Comparing the two realms reveals a profound irony. The celestial dominion's rigid structure preserved knowledge but stifled growth, while the free province's relentless innovation often discarded wisdom along with tradition. A telling example lies in their approaches to timekeeping. The Dominion maintained water clocks calibrated to ancient celestial charts, accurate to within minutes over centuries. The provinces embraced sundials with adjustable gears, brilliant in theory but unreliable on cloudy days. Neither system could fully reckon with the world as it was, only as they wished it to be. By the 3rd generation after the Schism, both empires bore the marks of their choices. The Dominion's meticulously preserved cities stood like frozen tableaus, their grandeur fading under layers of protective varnish. Meanwhile, the province's landscapes changed so rapidly that travelers joked about needing new maps monthly. What began as philosophical differences had hardened into opposing ways of existing, one fearing the chaos of change, the other terrified of the stillness of tradition. And in the contested lands between them, where smuggled ideas and goods slipped across borders, something unexpected was stirring. A quiet recognition that neither extreme had all the answers. The future, it seemed, might belong to those brave enough to walk the knife's edge between. Art in the two halves of the fractured empire bloomed in opposite directions, like vines twisting toward separate suns. In the Celestial Dominion, painters spent years mastering the 13 sacred strokes, passed down through generations, each brushstroke laden with symbolic meaning. A single peony petal might represent loyalty to the throne, while the angle of a mountain peak conveyed filial piety. Their murals told the same stories their ancestors had illustrated centuries before, emperors receiving heavenly mandates, scholars debating under cherry blossoms, battles where tradition always triumphed over chaos. Meanwhile, the free provinces treated art as a living experiment. Canvas was expensive, so they painted on whatever surfaces they could find, discarded pottery shards, stretched animal hides, even the whitewashed walls of demolished temples. A famous street mural in Tel Ashan depicted the empire's founding not as a divine covenant, but as a group of dusty travelers arguing over a campfire. The message was clear: greatness wasn't bestowed from above, it was hammered out through messy, passionate disagreement. Literature followed equally divergent paths. Dominion scribes copied ancient texts onto indigo-dyed parchment, adding meticulous footnotes but never altering a single character. Their libraries became mausoleums for perfect, unchanging words. One tragicomic incident saw a scholar exiled for adding a comma to a 900-year-old agricultural manual, even though the original punctuation had clearly caused crop failures. Across the border, reformist writers treated texts like communal property. They annotated, revised, and sometimes burned old books to fuel new ideas. Their most radical innovation, printing folk tales in the vernacular instead of classical script, so farmers and bricklayers could read them aloud at night. A smuggled copy of The Fox and the Granary, a Dominion children's fable about obedience, reappeared in the provinces as The Fox Who Built a Better Door, celebrating ingenuity over blind compliance. Social norms hardened along ideological lines. In the Dominion, a person's worth was measured by how closely they mirrored ancestral virtues. Marriage contracts included clauses requiring brides to replicate their grandmother's embroidery patterns, while judges wore masks modeled on the faces of long-dead magistrates to channel their wisdom. The provinces celebrated reinvention. It became fashionable for young people to take trial names at adulthood, shedding childhood identities like outgrown shoes. A blacksmith might spend a year calling herself Ember while apprenticing with glassblowers, then reinvent herself as Vine when learning viticulture. This cultural chasm turned even mundane interactions into ideological statements. A Dominion merchant would bow precisely 3 times when greeting a superior, measuring each incline to the exact degree prescribed in court manuals. A province's trader might slap the same man's back and propose a wager on tomorrow's weather, yet traces of their shared past lingered stubbornly beneath these contrasts. Both cultures retained the empire's obsession with tea, though they drank it as differently as they governed. Dominion tea ceremonies lasted hours, with each movement choreographed to honor the leaves' journey from mountain to cup. Provinces' tea stalls hung signs boasting quick brew for busy minds, serving bitter, oversteeped pints to arguing students. Even their reinterpretations of history revealed common roots. The Dominion's official chronicles portrayed the schism as a tragic but necessary amputation to save the body politic. The provinces taught it as a triumphant birth, yet both descriptions used the same metaphor of a living organism, a ghost of the unified world view they'd inherited. Occasionally, the divide sparked unexpected exchanges. When Dominion archaeologists unearthed a pre-imperial mosaic showing dancers in poses forbidden by modern etiquette, reformist artists smuggled sketches across the border and incorporated the heretical movements into popular theater. In retaliation, traditionalist poets began writing verse in the sparse, modern style of the provinces, but only to prove how empty it was, the irony. Young Dominion nobles secretly adored these stripped-down poems, copying them onto scented paper passed hand to hand. More often, though, contact bred conflict. A province's engineer's attempt to gift water pumps to a drought-stricken Dominion village ended with the devices smashed and the envoy's hair shorn, a traditional punishment for corrupting the innocent. Generations after the schism, these cultural choices calcified into unshakable identities. Dominion children memorized the 50 faults of the East alongside multiplication tables, while provinces' schoolbooks listed tradition as the first obstacle to progress. Yet in rare moments when a traveling musician played a half-remembered lullaby from the old empire, or when dust storms from the borderlands deposited pollen that made both realms' cherry trees bloom the same scarlet, people whispered questions they'd never voice aloud. Had something vital been lost when the empire split? Or had the fracture, however painful, given birth to something neither culture could have become alone? The answers, like the past itself, depended entirely on which side of the mountains you called home. The split didn't just divide an empire, it shattered an economic ecosystem that had thrived for centuries. Overnight, the harmonist Celestial Dominion and the reformist Free Provinces found themselves severed from the very trade networks that had made them wealthy. The famed Amber Road, once a lifeline for spices, silk, and ideas, became a scar across the landscape, its caravans halted by checkpoints where merchants now had to swear allegiance to one ideology or the other. In the Dominion, guilds doubled down on ancient production methods, weaving cloth on looms unchanged for generations and mining with tools blessed by priests but woefully inefficient. Meanwhile, the provinces embraced risky innovations, mechanized mills powered by water wheels, experimental crop rotations that sometimes failed spectacularly but occasionally revolutionized entire industries. The result, two economies moving at wildly different speeds, each convinced the other was racing toward ruin. Trade routes weren't just disrupted, they were weaponized. When the Dominion imposed a purity tax on goods crossing from the provinces, reformist merchants retaliated by flooding border markets with cheap imitations of traditional crafts, poorly made but affordable enough to undercut Dominion artisans. A single smuggled shipment of provinces' steel needles, sharper and cheaper than their hand-forged Dominion counterparts, nearly collapsed the traditional blacksmith guilds in 3 western cities. The economic Cold War grew so bitter that some towns built separate market squares, one for approved goods under blue awnings, another for innovator wares marked with green flags. Farmers who'd once sold to both realms now faced impossible choices. A vineyard owner in the borderlands might spend mornings harvesting grapes for Dominion sacramental wine, only to sneak the inferior clusters to provinces' distillers after dark, where they'd be turned into brandy-labeled, unshackled spirit. The division birthed new winners and losers. In the Dominion, the old noble families retained power but watched their wealth stagnate as traditional exports lost value. A single telling statistic survives from their ledgers. The price of lapis lazuli, once the empire's most prized pigment, dropped by 2/3 within a decade, not because the mines ran dry, but because provinces' artists had embraced cheaper alternatives like indigo and ground glass. Meanwhile, the provinces saw a merchant class rise from the chaos. Former scribes turned logistics masters, organizing caravans that zigzagged around Dominion embargoes. Apprentices who'd once bowed to guild masters now owned workshops selling clockwork toys to foreign markets. But this mobility came at a cost. Without the Dominion's safety nets, failed ventures meant ruin, and the province's bustling port cities soon developed stark divides between silk-robed trade princes and beggars who'd gambled on the wrong invention. Resource disparities turned into strategic vulnerabilities. The Dominion controlled the empire's richest silver mines but lacked the province's arable land. When drought struck, traditionalist farmers clung to rain dances while reformist agronomists tapped underground aquifers, then sold the surplus grain back to the Dominion at exorbitant prices. Salt, once so abundant it paved imperial storehouses, became a currency of its own. Dominion caravans carried it in locked chests like gold, while provinces' chemists experimented with evaporating seawater using mirrors and lenses. The competition grew so fierce that spies were dispatched not to steal military secrets, but recipe scrolls for glassmaking and fertilizer. Centuries later, economists would pinpoint this period as the birth of modern trade wars. The Dominion's insistence on stamping every coin with the emperor's profile, a practice the provinces mocked as worshipping metal, led to counterfeiting rings that undermined both economies. Reformist attempts to introduce lightweight trade tokens backfired when forgers realized the lead-based alloy could be shaved without detection. By the time border skirmishes erupted over a disputed salt flat, both sides were financially exhausted. The irony, their mutual dependence never truly vanished. Dominion temples still relied on provinces' grown incense for rituals, while reformist engineers secretly prized Dominion parchment for its unmatched durability. This uneasy symbiosis would eventually drive the first cautious emissaries back to the negotiating table, not out of wisdom but necessity. The empires might have divorced their ideals, but their purses remained stubbornly entangled. The severed halves of the empire didn't just drift apart, they sharpened their swords along ideological lines, turning philosophical differences into standing armies. The Celestial Dominion's military became a living monument to tradition. Their legions marched in formations unchanged since the Empire's golden age, their bronze-scale armor polished to mirror brightness even as neighboring kingdoms adopted lighter steel. Every battle standard bore the White Tower sigil of Thaddeus, and officers carried miniature copies of the Great Code into combat, consulting its passages before ordering charges. This reverence for the past reached absurd heights when Dominion engineers rejected a more accurate catapult design because its blueprint violated classical geometry principles. Meanwhile, the free provinces treated warfare like everything else, a problem to solve through ruthless innovation. Their steel colleges trained commanders in mock battles where rules changed hourly, and blacksmiths worked alongside generals to redesign weapons mid-campaign. A surviving province's field manual reads more like an inventor's notebook, with sketches of retractable bridge ladders and arrows that whistled to signal different maneuvers. Border skirmishes became laboratories for these competing philosophies. At the Battle of Twin Forks, Dominion forces arrayed themselves in the Unbreakable Square, a formation that had withstood 100 historical assaults. The province's commander, a former miner named Jerk, flooded the valley upstream and watched as the perfectly disciplined ranks drowned in their own rigidity. Yet innovation carried its own risks. When Province's engineers unveiled their prized storm bows, crossbows that fired 3 bolts in rapid succession, Dominion spies stole a prototype and discovered its Achilles heel, the intricate mechanism jammed in rainy weather. The next clash coincided with a thunderstorm, leaving Province's archers helpless as traditionalist cavalry cut them down. Espionage turned into its own art form. Dominion agents posed as traveling monks, their prayer scrolls hiding coded messages in the brushstrokes of illuminated letters. Province's spies infiltrated guild halls as journeymen, smuggling out forging techniques in songs taught to border tavern drunks. The most infamous double agent, a woman known only as the Weeping Bride, played both sides for a decade, feeding Dominion commanders false troop movements, while secretly diverting their silver shipments to fund Province's rebellions. Her eventual capture sparked a month of retaliatory kidnappings, until both sides realized they'd lost more officers to cloak and dagger games than to actual combat. Religious fervor poured gasoline on the simmering conflict. Dominion priests declared every battlefield hallowed ground, claiming their fallen warriors ascended directly to paradise. Province's chaplains preached that dying for progress was the highest sacrament, turning soldiers' deaths into propaganda tools. At the siege of Lurin Pass, this ideological clash reached its grotesque peak when Dominion defenders hurled not just stones but sacred relics from the walls, only for Province's sappers to repurpose the shattered statues as bridge supports. The ultimate irony: both armies still prayed to variations of the same pantheon, their rituals diverging so gradually that neither noticed until their holy days no longer aligned. Yet full-scale war was often averted by unexpected pragmatism. After the brutal Battle of the Salt Marsh left 12,000 dead, commanders from both sides met secretly in a ruined watchtower. Without consulting their governments, they agreed to a de facto truce along that stretch of border, not out of mercy, but because the marsh's brine ruined armor faster than either economy could replace it. Similarly, when a Dominion plague outbreak threatened to spill into Province's lands, healers from both realms established a neutral pest house in the no-man's land between borders. For 6 months, enemies in uniform worked side by side grinding herbs and boiling bandages, then returned to their trenches without a word when the crisis passed. These fleeting moments of cooperation hint at the deeper tragedy. The soldiers clashing across contested rivers often shared more with each other than with their own distant rulers. Veterans' diaries reveal uncanny parallels. Dominion grumbles about supply officers skimming grain rations, mirror provinces' complaints about quartermasters favoring elite units. When a freak blizzard trapped opposing regiments on a mountain pass in the dead of winter, they famously divided a cave down the middle, trading songs and tobacco across a line drawn in the dirt. That fragile truce lasted precisely until the snow melted, proving that even mortal enemies could recognize their common humanity so long as the weather demanded it. Religion's role in perpetuating the divide went far beyond battlefield blessings. In the Dominion, the Council of Ancestors decreed that all reformists were spiritually unclean, forbidding traditionalists from sharing meals or marriages with them, a ruling that turned family reunions into minefields. Province's radicals retaliated by branding harmonist rituals as witchcraft, burning centuries-old prayer wheels as engines of superstition. Yet beneath this venomous rhetoric, both cultures were wrestling with the same existential fear. If the other side's beliefs held even a grain of truth, their entire worldview might crumble. A Dominion priest's private journal confesses nightmares about meeting reformist ancestors in the afterlife and finding them wise and kind. A province's scholars' recovered letters reveal his secret fascination with traditionalist astrology, scribbled between equations for artillery trajectories. The most enduring legacy of this religious arms race wasn't in temples or battlefields, but in the quiet erosion of shared identity. Generations after the Schism, children in both realms grew up learning their cousins across the mountains weren't merely misguided, they were damned. Pilgrimage roads that had once connected holy sites were deliberately rerouted to avoid contamination. Sacred texts that had been identical for centuries now had key passages altered, each side airbrushing away evidence they'd ever worshipped the same gods in the same way. By the time historians began sifting through the wreckage, they found two versions of every scripture, two interpretations of every miracle, and no living memory of how seamlessly they'd once intertwined. The philosophical rift didn't just reshape politics, it rewrote the spiritual map of the fractured empire, turning shared temples into battlegrounds of competing truths. In the Celestial Dominion, the Council of Ancestors declared the harmonist philosophy sacred doctrine, elevating Thaddeus' writings to near-biblical status. His arguments for tradition weren't merely respected, they were chiseled onto temple walls where commandments once stood. Meanwhile, the free provinces dismantled altars to make room for halls of reason, where citizens debated ethics without priests as intermediaries. A traveling merchant from the borderlands described the surreal contrast. In the West, they kiss relics sealed behind glass. In the East, children toss broken statues into rivers to hear the splash. New sects sprouted like weeds through cracks in the old orthodoxy. The Dominion gave birth to the Keepers of the Unbroken Line, a militant order who tattooed passages from the Great Code onto their skin and executed anyone caught editing so much as a comma. Their rivals, the scribes of the living word, argued that even sacred texts needed pruning to stay relevant, a heresy punishable by having one's writing hand severed. Across the mountains, the provinces nurtured even wilder spiritual experiments. The Garden of Infinite Dawn rejected all written scriptures, teaching that divine truth could only be found in spontaneous song. Their open-air ceremonies, where worshippers improvised hymns atop half-built sculptures, scandalized traditionalists but drew thousands of disillusioned urbanites. Persecution followed innovation like a shadow. When a group of Dominion farmers began meeting in secret to read reformist poetry by candlelight, the local magistrate had their eyelids stitched shut to protect their souls from corrupting light. In retaliation, province's mobs raided monasteries, forcing captured monks to debate philosophy at sword point. Yet amid the violence, pockets of unexpected tolerance emerged. The port city of Vel Ashar, dependent on trade with both realms, established a neutral quarter where all faiths could practice so long as they paid a tax to the merchant council. Here, harmonist priests and reformist radicals shared the same bathhouses, if not the same beliefs, while children played games mixing elements of both traditions. Faith's dual nature, as both glue and wedge, became painfully clear during the Great Drought. Dominion priests insisted the crisis was divine punishment for straying from tradition, demanding ever more elaborate and expensive purification rites. Province's healers, meanwhile, prayed over new irrigation systems, blending invocations with engineering diagrams. When the rains finally came, both sides claimed credit, deepening the divide. Yet in the borderlands where suffering had been greatest, a third perspective took root: dusty roadside shrines where travelers left offerings to the God who listens, an amorphous figure combining elements of both pantheons. These unofficial sanctuaries thrived precisely because they had no official doctrine, just a promise of comfort for the desperate. Attempts to bridge the spiritual chasm often backfired spectacularly. The ill-fated Council of Stars brought together theologians from both realms to find common ground, only to collapse when Dominion delegates refused to sit beneath a roof built with heretical geometry. More successful were the quiet, personal reconciliations, like the province's glassblower who crafted stained windows for a Dominion cathedral in secret, embedding reformist symbols so subtle only another artisan would notice. Or the harmonist nun who smuggled traditional remedies to a province's plague ward, telling superiors she was gathering alms while keeping meticulous notes on how the new treatments worked alongside old prayers. These fragile gestures hinted at a truth neither realm could yet admit: their spiritual destinies were still entangled like vines from the same root. When Dominion archaeologists unearthed an ancient mosaic depicting the Empire's founding myth, they were horrified to find the central figure held not a scroll of laws, but a blank tablet, an image reformists immediately claimed as proof their vision was the older, purer faith. The discovery sparked riots in the streets and soul-searching in private chambers, forcing both sides to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps their most cherished beliefs weren't opposites at all, but fragments of something larger, shattered pieces waiting to be fit back together. The clash between harmonist traditionalism and reformist innovation didn't end with the Empire's fracture. It seeped into the intellectual groundwater of civilizations far beyond its borders. Centuries later, philosophers in distant lands would unknowingly revive fragments of this ancient debate, like archaeologists reassembling a shattered vase. Take the famed Codex of Almarin, written 300 years after the Schism by a scholar who'd never heard of Thaddeus or Elias. Its central argument, that societies must balance the weight of memory with the wind of change, could have been lifted directly from their unresolved duel. Even the structure of the text mirrored the Empire's divide. Traditionalist commentaries were penned in blue ink, reformist responses in green, creating a visual echo of the old conflict on every page. These ideas took root in unexpected soil. During the Age of Sail, when explorers mapped new continents, Dominion-style traditionalism resurfaced in colonial administrations that imposed rigid systems on unfamiliar landscapes, often with disastrous results. Meanwhile, reformist thinking flourished in port cities where cultural collisions sparked innovation. A striking example comes from the journals of Admiral Vasco da Ryan, who commanded both traditionalist and reformist crews during his voyages. His traditionalist sailors, adhering to centuries-old navigation charts, repeatedly ran aground on uncharted reefs. The reformist crews, who updated their maps daily based on local fishermen's knowledge, not only survived but thrived, yet Dorian still punished them for insubordination. The admiral's torn loyalties mirrored the Empire's fatal hesitation, proving some dilemmas outlived the empires that birthed them. The scientific revolutions of later eras became battlegrounds for these philosophies by other names. When astronomer Galen of Pyrrha challenged the geocentric model, harmonist-leaning scholars denounced him for defying the wisdom of the ancients, an eerie parallel to Dominion priests who'd condemned reformist engineers for improving water mills. Reformist-minded thinkers, in turn, embraced Galen's heresies with the same fervor their ancestors had shown for Elias' radical egalitarianism. The pattern repeated with every breakthrough: traditionalists warning of chaos, innovators dismissing caution as cowardice. Even the structure of modern universities, with their tension between conservative disciplines like classics and experimental fields like quantum physics, bears traces of this ancient divide. Key texts kept the debate alive across generations. The Meditations of Lady Varia, long thought lost, resurfaced in a monastery vault with marginalia from 12 different centuries, each annotator arguing with ghosts across time. Her nuanced take that tradition is the scaffold of progress, not its prison, offered a middle road few had dared to walk. Meanwhile, Elias the Unfinished City became required reading for revolutionaries from the New World to the Far East, though often stripped of its original context. A battered copy carried by the rebel leader Comyn during the Silver Revolts still survives, its margins crammed with notes comparing his struggle to the Empire's fracture. History's cruel joke, Min's movement eventually ossified into the very kind of rigid hierarchy Elias had despised, proving how easily revolutionary fervor can calcify into dogma. The most haunting question isn't whether these ideas still matter, but whether we've ever truly moved beyond their original conflict. Modern political divides between conservation and progress, between globalism and nationalism, often feel like variations on the same themes. A harmonist would nod approvingly at movements to preserve indigenous languages or restore historic buildings, while a reformist might see kindred spirits in tech disruptors and biohackers. Even our personal lives reflect this tension. How many families have fractured over the right way to honor traditions during holidays, or clashed over whether children should follow ancestral paths or carve new ones? Perhaps the most telling legacy lies in what didn't survive. The Empire's vast archives contained thousands of scrolls on compromise and mediation techniques for reconciling opposing views without surrender. These were the first texts burned by both factions during the Schism, deemed too dangerous for their potential to blur ideological lines. Today, as we face our own existential divides, their absence feels like a warning written in smoke. The true cost of ideological purity isn't just what we destroy in others, but what we erase of ourselves. The empires of the past may be dust, but their dual lives are not in history books, but in the choices we make every time we're forced to weigh the wisdom of the past against the promise of the unknown. The echoes of this ancient ideological duel resonate in every modern debate where progress squares off against tradition. Today's political and cultural divides often mirror the same fault lines that split the empire, just dressed in contemporary garb. Consider the tension between globalization and nationalism. Harmonist-style traditionalists rally around preserving cultural identity, language, and borders with near religious fervor, while reformist-minded globalists champion open exchange, innovation, and the dismantling of outdated systems. The rhetoric hasn't changed much in 1,000 years, only the battlegrounds have shifted from aqueducts and scrolls to trade agreements and social media algorithms. Technology amplifies these divides with terrifying efficiency. Where Dominion scribes once burned reformist pamphlets, modern algorithms create ideological silos, feeding users content that reinforces their worldview like a never-ending echo. A striking parallel emerges in the backlash against rapid technological change. The harmonists' fear of unblessed plows mirrors today's resistance to artificial intelligence or genetic engineering. Both eras share the same existential question: how much change can a society absorb before it ceases to be itself? The Luddites who smashed textile machines in the 19th century would have nodded in grim recognition at Dominion priests breaking water pumps during droughts. Even our personal lives aren't immune to this ancient tug of war. Parenting styles oscillate between strict tradition, "This is how we've always raised children," and experimental approaches, new research says. Corporate cultures clash over whether to emulate legacy institutions with rigid hierarchies or embrace startup-style agility. The irony: many disruptive modern companies eventually adopt the very structures they once mocked, just as the reformist provinces developed new elites to replace the old ones, proving that societies might cycle through these tensions endlessly. The empire's fate offers a chilling warning about absolutism in either direction. The Dominion's refusal to adapt left it technologically stagnant, while the province's reckless innovation sometimes discarded wisdom along with tradition. Modern environmental crises present a similar dilemma. Do we double down on industrial growth or retreat to pre-industrial simplicity? Neither extreme has all the answers, yet compromise often satisfies no one, just as the emperor's attempted middle road pleased neither Thaddeus nor Elias. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in what was lost when the empire fractured. The Great Code's meticulous records and the province's experimental zeal might have complemented each other beautifully if anyone had been willing to listen. Today, as we face our own ideological trenches, the ruins of that ancient conflict whisper a question: will we repeat their mistakes, or finally learn that progress without roots is chaos, and tradition without growth is slow suffocation? The answer will shape whether our societies become relics or bridges to something greater. Neither empire survived in its original form, but their downfalls revealed an unexpected truth: the very philosophies that tore them apart became their undoing in different ways. The Celestial Dominion's obsession with tradition ossified its institutions like a body preserving itself in amber. When the Great Drought of 1237 parched its heartland, governors refused to update irrigation laws, citing passages from the Great Code written for wetter centuries. Famine sparked rebellions that the army, still using Bronze Age siege tactics, couldn't suppress. The last emperor died clutching a scroll of agricultural edicts, while reformists designed windmills pumped water just beyond the crumbling city walls. Meanwhile, the free provinces collapsed under the weight of their own relentless innovation. Without stabilizing traditions, their experiment in perpetual reinvention spiraled into chaos. A currency reform meant to empower local councils backfired when 7 neighboring cities minted incompatible coins. By 1350, the provinces had fractured into a dozen squabbling city-states, each claiming to represent Elias' true vision. The final irony: their famed steel colleges, birthplace of military breakthroughs, were overrun by mercenaries hired to protect scholars from their own disillusioned citizens. Yet traces of both empires endured like genetic code in successor states. When the nomadic Kazan horde swept through the region 2 centuries later, they absorbed Dominion legal principles into their own oral traditions, preserving the Great Code structure while discarding its rigidity. Similarly, provinces' engineering manuals resurfaced in the libraries of maritime republics, their designs for modular ships revolutionizing ocean trade. The philosophical duel had outlived the civilizations that birthed it. Historians still debate whether the schism was inevitable. Archaeological evidence suggests the old empire's infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, grain stores could have weathered the droughts and invasions if not for ideological infighting. A recently discovered cache of letters between mid-level officials reveals desperate attempts to coordinate relief efforts across faction lines, thwarted by superiors obsessed with doctrinal purity. The real tragedy wasn't that the empires fell, but how much they might have achieved together. A joint research team recently proved this point by reconstructing a lost hybrid farming technique, combining Dominion soil conservation methods with provinces' crop rotation, that yields 30% more than either system alone. The most poignant lesson emerges from the borderlands, where descendants of both cultures now intermarry. Their folk tales speak of a ghost bridge that appears on certain moonlit nights, connecting the ruins of harmonist and reformist strongholds. Locals say if you walk its span, you'll hear whispers of all the words left unsaid when the empire split, arguments cut short, compromises never offered, futures abandoned in the name of winning a debate that ultimately left no victors. Today, as we face our own ideological divides, this ancient story urges us to ask, are we arguing to improve our world or merely to prove our side right? The empire's ruins offer no easy answers, only a warning etched in weathered stone that civilizations can perish not just from external blows, but from the wounds they inflict upon themselves in pursuit of purity. Perhaps true resilience lies not in choosing between tradition and progress, but in remembering that both are threads in the same fragile tapestry. The ruins of this ancient conflict hold up a mirror to our modern world, where ideological trenches seem to grow deeper by the day. What makes their story so painfully relevant isn't just the parallels. It's the warning etched into every shattered statue and rewritten scroll. The empire didn't collapse because it faced impossible choices, but because it lost the ability to hold opposing ideas in tension without tearing itself apart. Consider how we navigate our own cultural divides today. Social media algorithms function like the Dominion scribes and the province's pamphleteers, amplifying extremes while silencing nuance. Political discourse often rewards purity tests over compromise, much like the harmonist priests who excommunicated anyone questioning the Great Code. Yet history offers an alternative path: the borderland villages where farmers secretly traded seeds across ideological lines, or the plague doctors who set aside doctrinal differences to save lives. These fragile acts of cooperation suggest that survival doesn't demand uniformity. It requires learning to disagree without dehumanizing. The empire's fatal flaw was treating tradition and progress as irreconcilable opposites, when in reality they're interdependent forces. Think of a centuries-old oak tree. Its roots anchor it firmly in the soil, while its new leaves reach endlessly toward the sun. Modern societies thriving amid rapid change, from Japan's fusion of cutting-edge technology with ancient craftsmanship to Switzerland's direct democracy balancing innovation with stability, demonstrate this principle in action. The key lies in distinguishing between foundational traditions worth preserving, like equitable justice or respect for evidence, and incidental ones, like insisting on quills when pens work better. Leadership emerges as the decisive factor in whether differences become creative tensions or existential threats. The emperor's hesitation wasn't cowardice, it was a failure of imagination. Contrast this with figures like Lady Varia, who secretly funded schools while publicly upholding traditions, proving that bridge builders often work in the shadows. Today's leaders face similar tests, Will they exploit divisions for short-term gains or cultivate what the political scientist Danielle Allen calls civic friendship, the ability to disagree passionately while still seeing each other as part of the same story? Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in what didn't survive the schism: the Empire's vast archives on mediation and conflict resolution. These were the first texts burned by both sides, deemed too dangerous for their potential to blur ideological lines. Their destruction speaks to a universal human tendency: we'd rather be right than remain whole. Yet in our era of climate crises and global interconnectivity, the stakes are too high for such absolutism. The farmer who refuses to plant drought-resistant crops because "my father's father used this seed" ultimately shares the same fate as his neighbor who gambles everything on untested hybrids. Hunger doesn't discriminate between stubbornness and recklessness. So how do we apply these ancient insights? Start by examining your own mental border walls, those automatic dismissals of ideas labeled traditionalist or progressive without consideration. Notice when debates become more about tribal loyalty than truth-seeking. Practice what historian Rutger Bregman calls intellectual humility, the willingness to hold strong convictions lightly, like a scientist cherishes a theory while remaining open to better evidence. The Empire's ghost bridge still waits to be crossed, not by armies or ideologues, but by ordinary people willing to carry a single stone of common ground to lay upon its unfinished span. The choice before us isn't between past and future, but between learning from history's scars or adding new ones to its battered skin. That merchant dumping plows into the river, that scholar stitching shut a farmer's eyes. They weren't monsters. They were people who believed so deeply in their version of truth that they lost sight of their shared humanity. 5 centuries from now, when archaeologists sift through our digital ruins, what will they conclude about our ability to hold the tension between what was and what could be? The answer is being written not in scrolls or stone, but in the quiet choices we make every time we engage someone who sees the world differently. The debates among historians about this great schism rage as fiercely today as the ideological battles that shattered the empire centuries ago. At the heart of the controversy stands a single burning question: was the split inevitable, or could wiser leadership have preserved the realm? Traditionalist scholars like Professor Ilera Voss argue the fracture was centuries in the making, pointing to clay tablets from 200 years before the schism that already show regional disputes over irrigation rights and taxation. The empire was a pressure cooker waiting to explode, she writes in Sands of Discord, her landmark study of imperial decline. Thaddeus and Elias weren't the cause, merely the spark. Yet revisionist historians challenge this deterministic view. Dr. Kavian Morrow's radical reassessment, The Roads Not Taken, compiles newly discovered correspondence between mid-level officials, showing remarkable cooperation during early crises. One poignant letter from a borderland governor describes harmonist and reformist engineers working side by side to repair flood damage, until recalled by their fanatical superiors. The empire didn't lack solutions, Morrow insists. It lacked leaders courageous enough to implement them. This perspective gained traction after archaeologists uncovered a buried draft of the emperor's failed compromise at Astara, revealing provisions for shared research academies that might have bridged the divide. Interpretations of key figures remain hotly contested. Was Elias of Marakand a visionary liberator or a reckless demagogue? Traditional accounts portray him as a martyr for progress, but recently unearthed military logs suggest he authorized brutal purges of moderate reformists who opposed armed rebellion. Similarly, Thaddeus' reputation as an unbending traditionalist gets complicated by private journals showing his secret admiration for reformist agricultural techniques, though he never dared endorse them publicly. The discovery of Lady Varia's encrypted diaries further muddies the waters, revealing she acted as an unofficial mediator between the factions even while publicly condemning compromise. New technologies continue rewriting history in real time. Spectral imaging of charred scrolls from the Great Archives has reconstructed portions of the infamous Book of Thresholds, a forbidden text that reportedly offered a middle path between harmonist and reformist ideals. Meanwhile, isotope analysis of battlefield remains disproved the long-held belief that provinces divided along geographic lines. Soldiers from the same village often fought on opposite sides, their bones bearing identical mineral signatures. This wasn't cleanly split along regional or class lines, observes materials scientist Dr. Lian Zhao, whose team made the discovery. It was a fractal rupture dividing households, friendships, even individual consciences. The most heated debates swirl around what might have been. Economic historians run complex simulations showing the empire could have weathered the droughts by combining Dominion grain reserves with reformist distribution networks. Military analysts demonstrate how blending traditional infantry tactics with innovative siege engines might have repelled the later Kazan invasions. These counterfactuals aren't just academic exercises, they force us to confront how often history turns not on grand inevitabilities, but on specific moments when someone chose dogma over pragmatism. These scholarly battles spill into popular culture with fascinating results. The hit streaming series Twin Towers dramatizes the schism through a romantic subplot between harmonist and reformist scholars, a fictional device that sparked outrage among purists. Video games like Realm Divide let players rewrite history by finding compromise solutions the real figures missed, while best-selling novelist Amara Chen's The Bridge Builder imagines a secret society preserving forbidden knowledge through the darkest years of conflict. Even fashion trends reflect the enduring divide. Runway shows in Milan and Tokyo feature deliberate clashes of structured, Dominion blue silks with deconstructed, reformist green knits, proving this ancient fault line still sparks creativity. What makes these retellings matter isn't their historical accuracy, but what they reveal about our own era's ideological battles. Every generation projects its anxieties onto this story. During the Industrial Revolution, the schism symbolized machinery versus craftsmanship. In the digital age, it's framed as analog tradition versus disruptive innovation. The Empire's ghost continues to haunt us not because its answers were timeless, but because its questions remain unresolved. How much change can a society bear? What do we owe the past, and when does standing on principle become standing in ruin? The artifacts in museums and the debates in journals are more than relics, they're mirrors, showing us how thin the line between conviction and catastrophe can be. From blockbuster films to best-selling novels, the Empire's ideological fracture has been reimagined through countless lenses, each adaptation bending history to reflect contemporary anxieties. The Oscar-winning epic Towers of Thought dramatized the schism as a literal architectural duel, with harmonist masons building a soaring cathedral while reformist engineers constructed a bridge to nowhere. Though visually stunning, historians scoffed at its oversimplifications. The real Thaddeus never dueled Elias with chisels on a collapsing scaffold, and Lady Varia's nuanced diplomacy was reduced to a romantic subplot. Yet the film's central metaphor resonated. Civilizations aren't destroyed by the weight of tradition or the chaos of progress, but by their inability to hold both forces in balance. Video games have turned the conflict into interactive playgrounds. The strategy title Empire Divided forces players to allocate resources between preserving ancient libraries and funding alchemy labs, with each decision triggering cascading consequences. Favor tradition too heavily and your cities starve. Embrace innovation recklessly and revolts erupt. Meanwhile, the indie darling Ink and Ashes takes a more intimate approach, casting players as a scribe smuggling forbidden texts across ideological borders. Its most poignant moment comes when you must choose whether to correct a harmonist child's recitation of the Great Code, knowing the truth could get them killed, but lies perpetuate the cycle. Literature has explored the schism's human cost with particular depth. Amina Gesai's Pulitzer-winning The Marginalia Wars follows archivists on opposite sides who communicate through notes scribbled in shared manuscripts, their growing affection belying the dogma dividing their societies. The novel's brilliance lies in its quiet rebellion against binary thinking. Its protagonists don't renounce their beliefs, but discover gaps where dialogue can thrive. Contrast this with the popular Steel Codex trilogy, where the ideological duel becomes literal magic. Harmonist spells require perfect recitation of ancient texts, while reformist sorcery demands spontaneous poetry. The message is clear: both approaches have power, but neither can heal the land alone. Why does this centuries-old rift still captivate us? Because at its core, it's a story about impossible choices we still face. The hit podcast Half the Empire reframed the conflict through modern workplaces, comparing Dominion guilds to corporate bureaucracies resisting change, and reformist collectives to Silicon Valley disruptors burning bridges. Its most downloaded episode featured a psychologist analyzing how both factions succumb to certainty addiction, the dangerous comfort of treating complex problems as battles between absolute right and wrong. For those hungry to explore further, start with the documentary The Inkwell Rebellion, which uses stunning CGI to reconstruct lost debates from charred scroll fragments. Gamers should try The Last Compromise, a narrative adventure where every dialogue choice subtly shifts the ideological landscape. And don't miss the graphic novel Duel Empires, whose innovative split-page design lets you experience events through both factions' eyes simultaneously, a visual reminder that history isn't a single thread, but a tapestry of conflicting truths. What these retellings share is an understanding that great drama lies not in picking sides, but in the tension between them. Whether rendered in pixels or prose, the Empire's fracture endures because it mirrors our own unhealed divides between the comfort of the familiar and the lure of the new, between the voices whispering, "This is how we've always lived," and those daring to ask, "How else might we live?" The most powerful adaptations don't just recount history, they hold up a mirror showing us how easily conviction can curdle into dogma, and how the stories we tell about the past shape the futures we're willing to imagine. What makes this centuries-old clash between ink and sword so urgent today is how eerily it mirrors the ideological trenches we navigate in our own time. The same forces that split an empire, unyielding traditionalism clashing with relentless innovation, the fear of chaos battling the terror of stagnation, still shape our political landscapes, social media echo chambers, and even family dinner debates. Consider how modern movements fracture over purity tests, or how revolutions often consume their own children when ideals harden into dogma. The harmonists and reformists might have worn robes instead of pinstripes or hoodies, but their fundamental struggle was ours: how to build a future without burning the past. This story matters because it reveals ideas as the most potent force in human history, stronger than armies, richer than gold. A single philosophical disagreement over whether truth lives in scrolls or experiments didn't just reshape an empire. It redirected the flow of rivers, redrew maps, and rewrote what it meant to belong to a civilization. Today's culture wars over education, technology, or identity follow the same blueprint. When we dismiss these battles as just academic, we forget that the classroom debates of one era become the border conflicts of the next. The harmonists weren't wrong to fear unchecked change. The reformists weren't fools to challenge ossified traditions. The tragedy was their refusal to see that societies, like trees, need both deep roots and new leaves. The most haunting parallel lies in how both sides weaponized storytelling. Dominion scribes and provinces pamphleteers didn't just argue, they rewrote history in real time, painting their rivals as existential threats. Sound familiar? Modern algorithms do the same, feeding us narratives that flatten complexity into cartoons of heroes and villains. Yet the empire's ruins whisper a counterpoint. The borderland villages where farmers secretly shared seeds across ideological lines, or the plague doctors who set aside doctrine to save lives. These quiet acts of pragmatism suggest that bridges can survive even the fiercest wars of words if we're brave enough to build them. Here's the uncomfortable truth this story forces us to confront. The ideas we champion today, whether about democracy, science, or justice, will inevitably be challenged tomorrow. The real test isn't whether we're proved right, but whether we leave room to adapt without fracturing. The empire's fatal flaw wasn't its traditions or its reforms, but its inability to imagine that truth might live in the tension between them. As we stand at our own crossroads, facing divides that feel just as unbridgeable, their history offers both a warning and a fragile hope. Perhaps civilizations don't fall when they disagree, but when they forget that the future belongs to no single ideology, only to those willing to hold the pieces together long enough to see what might emerge from the cracks. Centuries may pass, but the story of this great schism still shudders through time, not as a relic, but as a mirror. What began as a debate between scholars in sunlit courtyards became a fault line that shattered an empire, proving that no force shapes history more powerfully than clashing visions of truth. The harmonists, with their reverence for the past, and the reformists, with their eyes fixed on the horizon, both sought to save civilization, yet their inability to bridge the gap between tradition and transformation doomed the very world they hoped to preserve. Here lies the tragedy. Their philosophies weren't opposites but complements. The great code's wisdom could have tempered reckless innovation, just as experimental zeal might have revived stagnant traditions. Instead, purity became more precious than survival. This isn't just ancient history, it's a cautionary tale for every era. The same forces that turned scrolls into weapons now polarize our digital age, where algorithms amplify extremes and dialogue collapses into echo chambers. Notice how easily us versus them narratives take root, whether in politics, technology, or culture. The Dominion's fatal flaw wasn't loving tradition, it was refusing to prune it. The province's mistake wasn't embracing change, it was confusing motion with progress, their shared failure, forgetting that civilizations like rivers need both banks to flow. Yet hope flickers in the margins of this story. The borderland farmers who traded seeds across ideological lines, the plague doctors who set aside dogma to heal, they understood what the philosophers did not, that rigidity and recklessness are equally deadly. Their quiet pragmatism whispers across the centuries, reminding us that the most revolutionary act isn't clinging to the past or burning it down, but discerning what to carry forward and what to leave behind. Let's leave the final word to Elias of Marikand, whose last letter, written in hiding before his execution, contained a startling admission. We were so intent on proving each other wrong, we forgot to ask what parts of each other's truth might be right. His rival Thaddeus, in a moment of private doubt, penned an equally revealing note. What if the code was never meant to be a cage but a compass? These weren't surrenders but realizations, that ideas, like swords, grow dull when never tested and brittle when never bent. So as you scroll through today's own ideological battlegrounds, ask yourself, where might you be clinging to dogma instead of wisdom? Where is fear of change, or fear of losing it blinding you to common ground? The empire's ruins stand as monuments not to the weakness of ideas, but to the danger of worshipping them. Share your reflections below. Do you see echoes of this ancient clash in our world? And if you found this journey through history's forgotten fractures as haunting as I did, don't forget to subscribe, because the past isn't finished speaking, and the next untold story might just hold the key to understanding our own divided age.